Hello again, folks. So here we are for the third in our series of pandemic lectures. I just wanted to begin this session with a kind of an offer for after class is done. If anyone is interested, I'm going to try to guide a kind of digital book reading club. Not for a long period of time or anything, I don't know, just we'll see who's interested. Probably not many of you, but maybe a few of you. And the book that I thought would be really useful to read is Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. This is a classic work of what's called Afrofuturist fiction, and it basically takes place, as you might guess, given the kind of movies that I put forward for the class, that this is a book that takes place in the wake of a kind of disaster, and it's people trying to kind of rebuild civilization, and it's really a classic, and I'm going to take a little while to go through it, and maybe we could have a couple of online discussions if folks are interested. So I'll give more details about that later at the end of the course, but this is something that's, I'm going to be doing it after the official end of our course, and it's, I guess, just a way of saying that I'm going to be here for you all, after the official course is over, because it seems like this situation with COVID is going to be going on for a while. The sort of lockdown kind of situation. So keep that in mind. Okay, so let's talk about liberation ideologies. I'm going to be talking about a couple of the texts that were on the list that I sent out on the kind of revised syllabus. The reduced revised syllabus. So these were all on the original syllabus. It's just there's a much reduced set of readings for the rest of the semester. I shouldn't say much reduced, but reduced. So we're going to be talking about Frederick Douglass. We're going to be talking about Cornel West and Idle No More. At least that's what I'm going to try to talk about today. Okay, so the first thing would be to go to your first slide that I have also sent along to you. So that's the one called The Opposite of Fascism. And I think it's useful to think about these liberation ideologies in the context of where we are just coming from, which is, reading Mussolini and Hitler and other fascist leaders. Liberation ideology folks very much see themselves as opposed to the kind of political ideology that fascists represent. They are much more inclined to be sort of democratic or grassroots. Many of them arise out of the 1960s, really. Not all of them, but a lot of them really are coming out of a kind of new political consciousness in a variety of groups who, after the 1960s, are lobbying for civil rights. So really, it's the civil rights movement in the United States that is the real touchstone for many of these movements. And then after that, you have indigenous rights, you have feminist rights, you have disability, you have animal rights, you have gay, lesbian, queer, trans. You have an explosion of groups who are clamoring for inclusion in a way that they feel that the sort of framework of liberal political rights has excluded them. And it's really difficult to classify them all together. It's in many ways there are many tensions between these various groups. So one really easy place to see that tension would be in thinking about a tension between indigenous rights and animal rights. So there have been a number of real clashes in the Niagara region, specifically around a treaty hunt at the Short Hills Provincial Park, where indigenous hunters are going into the park to hunt deer there, and this is something that local animal rights activists have protested against, continue to protest against. So the idea that all of these kind of liberation ideologies fit neatly together is just false. There are some ways in which they kind of go together, or there are certain similarities in terms of the way they try to challenge the kind of contemporary liberal rights framework, but many of the claims are entirely at odds with each other, and many of the frameworks are too. So it's just good to keep that in mind, that we're talking about these in this class as if they're basically the same. And again, they have some similarities coming out of the new social movements from the 1960s, but in many ways they really are at odds. Now some of them, and this is the kind of second point on that slide, some of them are certainly intersectional in the sense that they take a look at multiple frameworks of oppression or exclusion and try to think about the way that, let's say, the way that being a woman and queer and indigenous is different from just being, let's say, a white woman or a Latino woman who is not queer. Or disabled, or what have you. So there are folks who are trying to bring together this intersectional framework. It doesn't mean that you just sort of add up oppressions. It doesn't work that way. So there are certain ways in which, depending on which category you're in, let's say, if you are white and a woman, well, you may have certain advantages or certain privileges over someone who is a person of color, and it's not the case that you just kind of add all these things together and they neatly come out into sort of one even story of oppression where you can just put everything together. So sometimes being in a certain category gives you a little bit of an advantage versus one of the other categories. And none of these folks are claiming that these oppressions are in any way inherent or biological. All of these various intersectional frameworks are claiming that, look, the experience of being a person in one of these categories just shapes you differently because of the society that you're in. So it's not that there's something inherent. It's not that there's something biological. At least primarily, that's not what any of them are saying. So it's really about how who you are has been shaped culturally, and it's different for different cultures, different places in time. But in thinking about if you're in the United States or if you're in Canada, there are certain things that are similar about being a person of color, although obviously there are also some very important differences between the United States and Canada, obviously. Anyway, so it's not simple. It's not a simplistic framework, and it's best to keep in mind that there are always tensions between the various frameworks that we're going to be considering. Okay, so let's look at the second slide, which I've titled "To Speak of SJWs, Social Justice Warriors." I'm sure most of you know that term, and privilege. So the first point there on that slide is, as I was saying previously, that most of the folks in these liberation ideology camps, and they're not neatly defined camps, right? They don't have neatly defined borders, but for most of them, what unites them is the claim that while a liberal political society like Canada or like the United States claims to grant people formal equality of rights, formal equality of opportunity, in fact, these folks say in these liberation ideologies, that the actual experience, the lived experience, the substantive material experience, your actual daily life is different. And they will provide various kinds of statistical analysis, empirical analysis that actually support this, but it's also in part about kind of qualitative analysis, the way that people feel, the way that they report thinking and feeling about how they are treated in a liberal political society. So most all of them don't most all of them say, yes, we have formal political equality. Like, we recognize that the Constitution or the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada grants formal political equality. Nevertheless, it falls short of its promise. That is basically what most of these folks say. The claim is not that, at least usually, the claim is not that everything about the Constitution or the Charter of Rights and Freedoms needs to be thrown out. The claim is it doesn't live up to the promise of the formal equality that it promises, or that the formal equality is just not enough, that too much actually falls through the cracks, and power and oppression and exclusion seep through society, and that more needs to be done to address that, right? Okay. So I did want to say something just about the discussion of privilege, about the term privilege that comes up, because I think there are a lot of misunderstandings about this. This doesn't necessarily come up in our readings, but I think it's important here to say something about this. So most of the folks in these liberation ideologies would say that privilege is a real thing. But it's different depending on what social category you're in. And again, you're in multiple social categories: gender, race, ethnicity, immigrant status, ability or disability, straight, gay, lesbian, queer, trans. So you've got a whole bunch of these different things, and they're doing different things. But I guess I just wanted to say, and I think for many of you this will be obvious, but I wanted to say it anyway, that the claim about privilege is not, again, a claim about any kind of inherent. So the claim, for instance, about white privilege is not a claim about something about. So me, I am raced as white. I mean, I would be classified as white European. The claim is not that there's something about. So if someone says I have white privilege, they're not saying that there's something about my biology or something like that. They're saying that because of the way I look, because of the class that I belong to, that I have certain advantages or privileges that folks on average in other categories don't have. It doesn't mean that you can't be wealthy and African American and have certain advantages, let's say in class, over me. You absolutely can, and the folks who talk about white privilege would absolutely acknowledge that. The point is, on average, what advantages or benefits do I get simply from being white or male? So let me give you just a concrete example about this. So I know, and actually this is not about white privilege, this is about a different kind of privilege. It's about ableist privilege, ability privilege. So I am privileged. I have an ableist privilege in many different ways, but one specific way, and I've seen this year in and year out, is in student evaluations. Now, I also know that I get a bonus in student evaluations. People just rate white men more highly than they do women or people of color. There's lots of surveys and lots of experiments on this that indicate this. So I believe I benefit from that. That's not actually what my example is going to be about. My example is about ability. So one of the things, it's the comment that I have gotten, it's probably the single most frequent comment that I get on my evaluations. The comment is something about how cool it is that I walk around when I lecture. Now, I am not praising myself for walking around when I lecture. I'm just reporting to you what people put on evaluations. And they say it kind of, and actually I walk around a little less in our class, I realize. And of course I'm not walking around now at all. I know, because I'm doing this, on the YouTube. But I used to do this more frequently, and I would kind of go up and down the kind of steps a lot more in the seats, kind of do more walking around. People would comment on it and say they liked it, and it kind of kept them awake, and it was more entertaining, and blah blah blah. And so I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure that this meant that I got extra marks. I think people, because they liked me, and that was the reason they gave for liking me, they would give me higher marks. Now, if I were not able, if I were not physically able in the way that I am, I wouldn't be able to get that bonus. And so if you just translated me into a body that was bound to a wheelchair, I couldn't get that. And so I would actually lose, I think it's not hard to imagine that I would lose those marks that I was being given if I was bound to kind of lecturing behind a podium. So that is able-bodied privilege. That is ableist privilege. And I'm aware of that. And if someone raises that to me and they say, look how you're getting higher marks because of this, I have to acknowledge that this is true. To me, it's incontrovertible. Their claim to me is to be aware of this. And so when I'm looking at other people's evaluations, particularly in this case, a person who is disabled, to take that into account, to understand that they are not getting the same benefit that I get. It works that way with all of the kind of discussions of privilege. The claim is not that there's something wrong with me for being able to walk around. That is not the claim. Just as the claim of folks who talk about white privilege, their claim is not there's something wrong with being white. That is not what they are saying. Where it gets wrong is when if you as a person benefiting from ableist privilege or a person benefiting from white privilege do not recognize that and think that everybody else is on the same playing field as you, because they're not. Right? So that's what the claim is. That it has nothing to do with and I'm saying this because I'm imagining some folks in the class will have this misconception that they will think that claims about privilege are some kind of essentializing that, that male privilege is condemning men per se, or that white privilege is condemning white folks per se. That is not, there's probably you can probably find some extremist political theorist who would say that. We're not reading any of the folks like that. And by and large, mainstream folks in these liberation ideologies, social justice warriors, what have you, are not basically saying any of these things. So I'm able-bodied, white, man, straight, and these are all privileges. I get advantaged in class. I come from upper middle class background. These are all privileges I have. It would be ridiculous for me to deny that these are privileges. I can, and for someone to raise this to me is not for someone to just sort of browbeat me and for me to feel guilty. It's for me to recognize that when I am making judgments about others, that I try to understand that their experiences are different from my experience, and that there are certain arenas in which I gain benefits. It doesn't mean I benefit absolutely every time. The number of times that I had to sort of recognize my privilege, one other thing, just in regard to white privilege, when I finally had black friends at my university, and I didn't my first couple of years there, and this was in Los Angeles, in inner city Los Angeles. And when I finally started to hear the stories of the way that they would be actually physically restrained on campus when they were walking through campus, they would be, campus security would approach them. I was never approached by campus security. I broke the law a bunch of times on my campus. I did a bunch of stupid, irresponsible things. Nobody ever did anything to me. Nobody ever tried to stop me. I could do whatever I wanted. But these friends of mine, would tell me, and so, finally I could hear these stories, and then I realized what was going on, that they would be detained. They would be not harassed in the sense of campus security was trying to make them feel bad, but in effect, campus security was harassing them by making them feel like they didn't belong there because they were young and African American and walking across the USC campus, and so they were seen as not belonging, and so they were asked for their ID. Nobody ever asked me for my ID when I was walking across campus, while I was drunk, while I was breaking law, doing a variety of things. So that's the kind of recognition that these folks are calling for. Okay, so let me see. I've already gone a little bit longer on this than I had meant to. So let me just say something quickly about Get Out, and then I'm going to cut this, and then I'm going to have another lecture where I actually talk about Frederick Douglass. So Get Out is our film for this week. It is a fantastic film. It should have won the best Oscar. Even if you don't think it should have won the best Oscar, the fact that The Shape of Water did is ridiculous. And hey, I live in Hamilton. Shape of Water was filmed in Hamilton, and I like the film, but come on, that's crazy. Anyway, that's side note. So Get Out fits really nicely in our discussion of liberation ideologies, in particular in the era of Black Lives Matter, and we're reading Black Lives Matter for the end of the week. I'm just going to put it out there. I'm not going to say anything more than to say kind of the secret of this. What's special about this film really is who the real villain is, or what the actual motivation of the villains in this film is. So it may be obvious to you, but think about who is actually being satirized and who is actually being criticized in and through the characters of the the villains, and their spoiler alert, there's more than one. That's the special thing about this film. It's not just a hey, there are racists out there and they're bad, right? That's not what's interesting about this film. Okay, so I'm going to cut this now. And look for me on the other side. I will have a video where a lecture where I will specifically talk about Frederick Douglass and Cornel West, and then I don't know more. Okay, take care of yourselves, take care of each other. Bye-bye.